Hi everybody, Mike from the lab here today to show you how to draw this wonderful sparkling cup of joe inside of Adobe Illustrator CC. Now I'm working inside of Windows as well as Adobe Illustrator CC. However, this will work in Mac and previous versions of Adobe Illustrator, including CS6 and CS5. Let's get started. First thing I need to do is create my new document. So I'll go to File, New. And I need to title my document. So let's call this Coffee Cup. And I'm going to go ahead and select a profile of Web and change my size to 1024 by 768. We're going to create this coffee cup for a website. Everything else should line up correctly by default, and I'll go ahead and select OK. The next thing we need to do is firstly draw our background. That's pretty easy to do. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and allow the intersections to occur and draw a rectangle the size of our document. Now by default, I believe it will give you a stroke, although it will use your last stroke settings. But if you see a stroke, as you do in mine, inside of the tool palette, I'll simply need to select that stroke and select None to remove that stroke. The next thing I need to do is I'll go ahead and fill my background with a brown color. Let's select a fairly desaturated, kind of a dark brown. Something like that color. That's pretty good. You may, however, select whatever color you want. Now notice that I've got this strange little white line occurring here. I can fix that by selecting the object with my selection tool and clicking the top left reference point at the top here. Go to my X value and punch in a number of 0. I'll hit Tab to go to my Y and select a number of 0. And then I'll double check and make sure that my width and my height are set to 1024 by 768. I'll press Enter to commit those values. There we go. Everything's lined up nicely. Let's go ahead and lock that layer inside of our Layers palette. So I'll go to my Layers palette here. If you don't see the Layers palette icon off to the left here, which by default it is, you can simply go to Window, Layers to open up your Layers palette. I'll go ahead and lock that layer as well as double click its name to rename it BG for background. The next thing I need to do is go ahead and create a new layer in which we'll create our illustration. So I'll click the new layer icon at the bottom of the Layers palette. And with that selected, I'll go ahead and hide my Layers palette. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and let's get started. The first thing I need to do is go ahead and select a fill different from the one we previously drew. Whenever you create a new object, it's always going to default back to the last used fill and stroke. I don't want the same color as I have here. I actually want a white coffee cup. So I'm going to select a white color. Now I don't want a perfectly white coffee cup. I think for illustration purposes, coffee cups they're kind of that sort of cardboard texture or plastic. It tends to be just a little bit off-white. So I'll just click a white that's slightly gray. I'll go ahead and click OK. The next thing I need to do is go ahead and draw a rectangle by selecting the rectangle tool or pressing the M key on your keyboard and draw out a rectangle that's roughly going to be the height of our coffee cup. Now, not the cap of the coffee cup, but just the cup itself. Good. Now I'm going to go ahead and press the A key to bring up my direct selection tool, and I'm going to click off to the side of the document to deselect my rectangle. And then I'm going to grab the top left corner here and click and drag. And while I'm doing this, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and that's going to force me to remain on the same line here. It won't let me drag down or up unless it's at a 45 or 0 or 90 degree angle. It'll remain at those 45 degree angles. In this instance, I want it to remain kind of on the 0 degree angle and kind of select kind of the edge of what our coffee cup is going to look like. Good. The next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and select my selection tool, click off to the side, and then reselect my object. This just makes sure that I have all 4 points selected and the entire object selected. The next thing I'm going to do is right-click the object and select Transform and then Reflect. By default, this preview checkbox is turned off. Go ahead and turn it on. It's always a little bit useful. The next thing I want to do is I'm going to make sure my vertical axis is selected. And I'm going to go ahead and select Copy to copy that object. With my selection tool, I'm going to go ahead and click and drag this over while holding down the Shift key and waiting till it about intersects about halfway until I get a good width of a coffee cup, and I'm going to go ahead and deselect it just to kind of see what I'm doing. And I think that's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and select both by selecting one, holding down the Shift key, and selecting the other. Now I need to go to my Pathfinder palette. I can get to this by going to Window, Pathfinder, and there we go. Inside of my Pathfinder, I want the Unite option. We'll be using this a lot today, so remember where it is. And I'll unite those two objects together. Now my coffee cup's looking a little bit short, so I'm going to go ahead and click and drag it up. Feel free to adjust your coffee cup as you see fit. I'm going to kind of drag it to the middle of the document there to make it a little bit easier until it kind of forms a coffee cup. If you need to redo the previous steps to get this angle just right, one thing to note that as I drag this coffee cup up, I am going to change this angle as you can see here. So be careful about that, about making any dramatic changes. Try and get it to look roughly like a coffee cup. I'll go ahead and press Command Z or Control Z to undo that. The next thing we need to do is start to form the lid. You can do that by creating another rectangle. I'll grab my rectangle tool out of the Tools palette. You can also press M to select those. And I'm going to hold down Spacebar to kind of position this exactly the kind of height that I want. Holding down Spacebar lets me move around the object before I've let go of the mouse button. And I'll draw a shape roughly about half the size of my coffee cup, leaving a little bit of a lip off to here. The next thing I need to do is grab my direct selection tool, click off to the side to deselect my object, and I'll go ahead and move that anchor point in to give my lid a little bit of an angle. I'll go ahead and press V to grab my selection tool, once again deselecting the entire object and then reselecting it. I'm going to right click it, go to Transform, and then go to Reflect. Once again I'll click Copy. We've got an exact duplicate of that object. I'll go ahead and move that over while holding down the Shift key to force myself to constrain proportions. I don't need to worry about if this lip matches my cup exactly. Just go ahead and follow along like this. I'll hold down the Shift key to select both sides and select Unite to create one object. The next thing I need to do is make sure that my lid is not to the left or slightly to the right of my coffee cup. So I'll hold down the Shift key to select both objects. When I do so, it gives me options to my alignments, and I want to select Horizontal Align Center. They are aligned, so no movement happened, but just in case they weren't. I'm going to go ahead and select my coffee cup and nudge it up just a tad. There we go. Now I need to grab my rectangle tool, which I can do by pressing the M on my keyboard, and let's draw the very top of my coffee cup. Once again, holding down Spacebar, we're going to follow the exact same, so roughly about half of my coffee cup. Once again, pressing A to select my direct selection tool, grabbing this anchor point and dragging it in. Probably going to want a slightly sharper angle for this. I'm going to press the V key to bring up my selection tool, deselect the object, and then reselect it. I'm going to go right click it, go to Transform, Reflect. Once again, I'm going to copy this object. And I'm going to click and drag, holding down the Shift key and getting my top. Once again, I'm going to hold down the Shift key and select both of those objects and unite them. Now let's make sure our coffee cup, now this is looking a little short, so I'm going to go ahead and maybe increase the size here. Feel free to adjust this as you see fit. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag to make a selection of all three objects that I have created. And I want to center them in the center once again. I want to align them in the center, There we go. There's a little bit of a line. I may need to nudge things around. There we go. Good. And there's always a little bit of variation that's going to occur with this. So I'm going to click and drag. I think my coffee cup, I'm going to adjust this part like that and make that just a little bit bigger. There we go. I like that. Good. The next thing we need to do is create the shadows on our coffee cup, these three objects that you see here. And we'll do that by using some of our existing shapes to make sure that everything lines up correctly. We can do that by grabbing our selection tool, selecting our object that we want to copy over. And I'm going to go to Edit, Copy. Or notice the hotkey of Control-C. On a Mac, this would be Command-C. Then I'll go to Edit, Paste in Place. And I now have a duplicate of my object on top of my old one. I'm going to go ahead and press P to grab my pen tool. And I'm going to add 2 anchor points. Notice that when I mouse over this path, my pen tool now has a little plus icon. I'm going to add 2 anchor points, roughly about where I want my path to cut off. The next thing I need to do is go ahead and grab my direct selection tool by pressing the A key, and then selecting the anchor points that I no longer desire. I'll hold down Shift and select multiple ones of them. Now when you united your object, you may see more anchor points than you see here. Simply select those and press the Delete key to get rid of them. The next thing I need to do is go ahead and close off my path. I'll do that by pressing the P key and grabbing my pen tool. Now I need to make one of these anchor points the active anchor point because right now it thinks that I want to draw a new path. I can simply do that by clicking this anchor point with the pen tool. That is now the active anchor point from which I am drawing. And I'll go ahead and close off my path like so. I'm going to go ahead and press my V key. I'm going to grab my A key and I'm going to adjust that point slightly to get it to line up completely vertical. Good. The next thing I'm going to do is grab my selection tool and we're going to change the fill of my object. I'll go ahead and deselect it and reselect it just to make sure I have it completely selected. And I'm going to double click the fill and select pure black. Now obviously that's not what a shadow looks like, so I'm going to go into my appearance palette right here. If you don't see the appearance palette, you simply need to go to Window, Appearance. And we'll change the opacity from 100% to 20%. There we go. That looks much more like a shadow. Go ahead and hide that. Now let's create the other shadow on side of this coffee cup here. I'm going to do it the same way I did with the previous shadow by selecting the object. This ensures that our shadow lines up perfectly with the object above it. I could simply do it with just the pen tool, but this may cause me to be just a fraction of a pixel off. Little variations can happen with that. So I'll select my object with the selection tool, and I'll go to Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste in Place. Now I have an object in front. Right now, I'm going to go ahead and change the fill to black, just so I can see what I'm doing a lot better. And I'm going to go through the same process that I did before. I'm going to go ahead and make a selection of that object and grab my pen tool and add points on the line where I think that there should be a shadow. Roughly about right there. That looks pretty good. And then I'll go ahead and press the A key, and using the Shift key to select multiple anchor points, I'll go ahead and delete any of the paths or stray paths that I don't want. I'll press the Delete key to get rid of those. Now I kind of have to fix my shadow. I can do that with the pen tool. I need to make the active. So in case here I need to draw a line from this anchor point to this anchor point, I can do so by simply clicking it, and that makes it the active anchor point. And then I need to kind of mouse over to find it and click it to draw a path, like so. The next thing I need to do is go ahead and close that path off by clicking the anchor point at the top here. And then I can go back to my appearance palette and change my opacity to 20%. Now we'll notice that our shadows are kind of overlapping in weird ways. So what I need to do is I need to go to my layers palette, and because that object is selected, I can see here that the meatball shows me which layer I have selected. So even though it's kind of hard to tell from the thumbnail which path I have selected, I can see that I have it selected by the meatball. And I'll go ahead and click that path down below a few objects, but not below my coffee cup itself. And there we go. That's kind of our coffee cup is kind of now taking shape. And don't worry if your path is a little bit off here, if things are a little bit not quite adjusted. We're going to come back and fix our shadows so that they look just right or just the way that we want them. We can always adjust these shapes or paths, but we'll do that at the end. So the next thing we need to do is draw this third shadow, which kind of comes across here. And I'm going to just completely use the pen tool to create that object. I'll go ahead and hide all of my other layers to kind of show that. I'm clicking the eyeballs, and I clicked and dragged. If you click and drag your eyeball inside of the eyeball inside of the layers palette, then you can simply hide all of those layers. That way I just have this selected. I'll go ahead and grab my pen tool, and as I mouse over that anchor point, it indicates that I'm going to click on that anchor point. Very good. And then I'm going to click along this line. It should automatically kind of line up as soon as you mouse over that point. And let's kind of create a shadow roughly about right there, making sure that everything kind of lights up in the manner that you see here. And then I'll click the last anchor point, again lining everything up so that I have a little green X in the word anchor. And then I'll go ahead and close my path. If you don't have your object lining up perfectly as mine, it's usually best to start over as opposed to trying to zoom in and getting everything to line up perfectly. The next thing we need to do is go to our appearance palette, and we'll change our opacity, not 20%, but 10%. Because these shadows are overlapping, 10% is actually going to give us a better effect, I think. I'll go back to my layers palette and go ahead and show all of those previous hidden layers. There we go. I may need to reorder some things so that my newly created shadow layer, I need to click and drag him below. There we go. And if any of your shadows need adjusting, just be sure not to adjust lines that are kind of lining up with the previous paths, that you grab your direct selection tool and you can select these lines as I'm doing here. Let's say I wanted to drag this out. I'm going to hold down the Shift key to constrain myself to a 90-degree angle and drag that shadow out just a little bit so that they kind of line up the way that a shadow naturally would. You can feel free to adjust anchor points that aren't on lines and such. Go ahead and maybe hide those layers and maybe adjust this, oops, by just grabbing this anchor point. Maybe you want to adjust that angle slightly. I like that. I'll go ahead and return the visibility of those layers. Oops, now that I've adjusted that, I kind of want to fix this. Kind of create that effect. There we go. Good. The last thing that we need to create is the two drips of coffee coming out of that area like that. We'll go ahead and create them kind of off to the side at first. I'm going to grab my rectangle tool and draw a rectangle kind of off to the side here. And I'm going to kind of hold down the space bar and roughly see where I want this drip size to be. That's pretty good. The next thing I need to do is change its color, its fill color. So I'll double click fill, and let's get a nice deep. Let's make it kind of a darker coffee. Good. The next thing I need to do is add the circle to my drip. So I'm going to click and hold my rectangle tool and select the ellipse tool. Let's zoom in a little bit here. I'll press the Z key to grab my zoom tool and click and drag like that. And I'll need to return to my ellipse tool, which is the L key. And I'm going to click and drag a circle out here. And my circle, and when I'm dragging, I need to make sure that I'm holding down the Shift key. You'll notice that the Shift key forces me to draw a perfect circle, which is what we want here. And don't worry if your circle doesn't perfectly align. You can always, if your circle falls outside of our box a little bit, you can always grab your selection tool, grab one of the corners, and hold down Shift and get it to align perfectly. And it should snap to alignment so that you have pretty much what you see here. And let me get that to snap just right. There we go. That's pretty good. Let's go ahead and get those just right so they line up perfectly. You may need to zoom in a little bit, and then let's adjust its intersection so that it lines up with that line. Still a little bit off. That's a little strange. That might happen. That's pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag and make a selection out of both of them, and then unite the shapes together to give me one object. I'm going to go to Edit, Copy to make a duplicate of it, and then we're going to go to Edit, Paste in Front, which will create another object. I'll go ahead and click and drag it off to the side here. And one of the things I want to do is I want to make this one a little bit longer, but if I do that to united objects like this, and I drag it out, it's actually going to destroy that nice curve that we created by uniting a circle and a triangle. I'll press Command or Control Z to undo that. What I need to do is I need to grab my direct selection tool. I'll do that by pressing the A key, click and drag and make a selection of all the anchor points that I know are right there. And now, as I move those points down, I can make my object longer and yet maintain that distance. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab my selection tool by pressing the V key, and then I'm going to click and drag those shapes over. Now these are going to be hidden by the coffee cup, so I can go ahead and kind of decide a little bit of where I want them. I think I'm good with that. The next thing I need to do is I'm going to go ahead and select the actual layers or path layers in here. And I'll go ahead and hold down the Control key so that I can select multiple path layers here. I'm going to click and drag those. Let's see, we want them below the shadows. So just above the coffee cup, but below the shadow. There we go. And I'll press Command 0 to kind of see what we've created here so far. And we see that we've created a fairly geometric shape, a fairly balanced, symmetrical shape using Pathfinder, a little bit of the pen tool, and our basic shape tools. And you can create a lot of really interesting illustrations in this same way. You can get more complex if you wish. You can actually go a little bit further and add a little bit of curve to this line right here, as I have done with the shadow. Feel free to kind of experiment with that. With circular objects, shadows tend to curve in a little bit. Feel free to play with that. You'll need to use the pen tool. But you can also create with the same kind of technique objects like this. So this kind of simple illustrative look is really, really easy, and you can get really, really fast creating these kinds of objects in this kind of very, very popular look today. And incidentally, this is from the University of Houston Style Guide. There's our coffee cup right there. I decided to recreate it. Anyway, that's the lesson for today. Thanks, guys.